In December 1999, police executed a search warrant at Bar Jonah's apartment in connection with child molestation case. What they found inside was a nightmarish scene that would forever mark Nathaniel Bar Jonah as one of the most disturbing criminals in American history. The search revealed an extensive collection of child pornography, along with journals detailing Bar Jonah's fantasies of kidnapping, torturing, and eating young boys. These writings included lists of potential victims, including Zachary Ramsey. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In Bar Jonah's kitchen, investigators found several human bones and pieces of meat that they believed to be of human origin. Forensic analysis later confirmed that some of the bones were consistent with those of a young child, though they could not definitively link them to Zachary Ramsey. Bar Jonah had also distributed the meat to his neighbors, claiming it was deer or elk. Many later recalled eating meals prepared by Bar Jonah, unaware that they might have been consuming human flesh. This revelation added an even more macabre layer to the case, further fueling the media frenzy that surrounded the trial. Certainly. Let's expand on the case of Nathaniel Bar Jonah with more detailed accounts of his life, crimes, and the investigation that followed. This version will dig deeper into his background, the psychological profile, the investigation, and more about his victims and community impact. Nathaniel Bar Jonah, born as David Paul Brown in Worcester, Massachusetts, grew up in what seemed to be a fairly typical household. However, beneath the surface, David exhibited deeply troubling behavior from a very young age. His mother described him as a difficult child, but no one could have predicted the monstrous acts he would later commit. From an early age, Bar Jonah displayed a fascination with violence. At the age of 7, he convinced a 5-year-old neighbor girl to follow him into his basement, where he proceeded to strangle her with a rope. The girl survived when her screams attracted attention, and a neighbor intervened. This incident marked the beginning of a pattern of violent behavior, yet, disturbingly, Bar Jonah faced no serious consequences. This early leniency in his life set a dangerous precedent, allowing him to continue his dark behavior unchecked. As Bar Jonah grew older, his obsession with violence only intensified. During his teenage years, he was known to lure younger children into secluded areas where he would assault them. His methods became increasingly sadistic, and he seemed to gain a perverse sense of pleasure from inflicting pain and exerting control over his victims. Despite these clear warning signs, Bar Jonah managed to avoid any serious legal repercussions, a pattern that would tragically continue throughout his life. In 1977, when Bar Jonah was 20, he committed what could have been his first murder. He had abducted 2 boys, aged 8 and 10, under the guise of giving them a ride. He drove them to a secluded area where he strangled them and left them for dead. Fortunately, both boys survived, and Bar Jonah was arrested for attempted murder. However, the justice system once again failed to keep him behind bars for long. After serving just a brief sentence, Bar Jonah was released on parole. Shortly after his release, Bar Jonah legally changed his name to Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This bizarre decision was influenced by his growing delusions of grandeur and religious fanaticism. He believed himself to be a reincarnated angel sent by God to carry out divine missions. His name change was part of his attempt to reinvent himself and further distance himself from his previous identity. The name Bar Jonah, derived from the Bible, added an eerie layer to his already twisted persona. In 1991, Bar Jonah relocated to Great Falls, Montana, after another short stint in prison for assaulting a child. This move marked a new chapter in his life of crime. Great Falls provided Bar Jonah with a fresh start, where he could operate under the radar, largely unnoticed by authorities and neighbors. Bar Jonah's arrival in Montana coincided with his descent into even darker fantasies. By this point, his obsessions had evolved beyond sexual predation. He began to fantasize about cannibalism, particularly the consumption of young boys. Bar Jonah's fantasies were not just confined to his mind. He meticulously recorded them in journals that would later be discovered by investigators. February 6, 1996, was a cold morning in Great Falls, Montana. 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey left his home early in the morning, as he did every school day, to walk to Whittier Elementary School. He was known to be punctual, and when he didn't arrive at school that day, his mother, Rachel Howard, grew concerned. She reported him missing, sparking an immediate search effort. The initial investigation into Zachary's disappearance yielded few clues. Witnesses reported seeing Zachary walking down the street near an alley, but after that, he seemed to vanish into thin air. Search parties combed the area, but there was no sign of the boy. Flyers were posted, and the community held vigils, but Zachary was never found. As days turned into weeks, investigators began to focus on potential suspects. Nathaniel Bar Jonah quickly became a person of interest. He lived just a few blocks away from Zachary's route to school, and his history of predatory behavior towards children raised immediate red flags. One witness reported seeing a large, heavy-set man matching Bar Jonah's description following Zachary on the morning of his disappearance. Another claimed to have seen Bar Jonah standing near a dumpster in the alley where Zachary was last seen. These testimonies, combined with Bar Jonah's disturbing history, led investigators to believe that he was involved in Zachary's disappearance. Despite their suspicions, authorities were unable to find concrete evidence linking Bar Jonah to the crime. Without a body or any physical evidence, they were forced to let him go. Zachary's disappearance remained a mystery, and his family was left in agonizing uncertainty. 3 years later, in December 1999, authorities in Great Falls executed a search warrant at Bar Jonah's apartment. The warrant was related to an ongoing investigation into a separate case of child molestation. What they found inside his apartment shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Bar Jonah's apartment was a chamber of horrors. The walls were adorned with drawings of children, many of them depicted in disturbing, violent scenarios. Investigators found an extensive collection of child pornography, further solidifying his status as a sexual predator. But the most chilling discoveries were yet to come. In the kitchen, investigators found what appeared to be human bones, along with several bags of meat stored in the freezer. At first glance, the meat could have been from any animal, but forensic analysis soon revealed a horrifying truth. Some of the meat samples contained human tissue. The remains were consistent with those of a young boy, but they were too degraded to be definitively linked to any specific individual, including Zachary Ramsey. Even more horrifying was the revelation that Bar Jonah had been serving this meat to his neighbors, claiming it was venison or elk. He had invited them over for barbecues, where he fed them meals that may have contained the remains of his victims. When this information came to light, many of Bar Jonah's neighbors were left sickened and traumatized by the realization that they had unknowingly participated in his gruesome acts. Nathaniel Bar Jonah's psychological profile paints a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. Experts who studied his case noted that he exhibited signs of both psychopathy and severe delusional disorders. His belief that he was a divine figure, combined with his lack of empathy and sadistic tendencies, made him a particularly dangerous predator. Bar Jonah's fixation on cannibalism is one of the most disturbing aspects of his psychological makeup. Cannibalism, in his case, was not just about the act of consuming flesh. It was a manifestation of his need to dominate and dehumanize his victims completely. By eating his victims, Bar Jonah believed he was absorbing their power, further feeding into his delusions of grandeur. His journals, which detailed his fantasies and desires, provided a chilling insight into his mind. In one entry, he described how he wanted to capture, torture, and ultimately consume young boys. He meticulously planned his attacks, often scouting for potential victims in public places like parks and schools. His ability to compartmentalize his dark desires allowed him to maintain a facade of normalcy in his day-to-day life, further complicating the investigation. In 2002, Nathaniel Bar Jonah went to trial, facing charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. The trial was highly publicized, drawing national attention due to the horrifying nature of the crimes and the ongoing mystery surrounding Zachary Ramsey's disappearance. Prosecutors faced significant challenges in building a case against Bar Jonah, particularly in the absence of definitive physical evidence linking him to Zachary's murder. The lack of a body made it difficult to secure a conviction on that charge. However, the evidence found in Bar Jonah's apartment, combined with witness testimonies and his criminal history, was enough to secure convictions on several other charges. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence presented at the trial was Bar Jonah's journal, which detailed his cannibalistic fantasies and plans to abduct and torture children. Prosecutors argued that these writings were not merely fantasies, but a blueprint for the crimes he had committed. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that the journals were merely the writings of a disturbed mind, not proof of actual criminal behavior. Despite these arguments, Bar Jonah was convicted on multiple counts, including kidnapping and sexual assault. He was sentenced to 130 years in prison without the possibility of parole. However, he was never convicted of Zachary Ramsey's murder due to the lack of conclusive evidence, leaving the boy's fate unresolved. Nathaniel Bar Jonah's death in prison in 2008 from heart failure brought a grim chapter in American criminal history to a close. However, his death also left many questions unanswered. The full extent of his crimes remains unknown, and the fate of Zachary Ramsey continues to haunt investigators and the boy's family. Nathaniel Bar Jonah's crimes are some of the most horrifying in criminal history, marked by brutality, deception, and an unsettling focus on cannibalism. His criminal behavior spanned decades, involving numerous children, many of whom were left traumatized or unaccounted for. Bar Jonah's violent tendencies first manifested in the early 1970s when he was just a teenager. Although many of these incidents were not widely reported until after his arrest, they were pivotal in understanding the depth of his depravity. His first known crime was the 1975 attempted murder of a young boy. After luring the boy into a secluded area, Bar Jonah strangled him until he lost consciousness. He believed the boy to be dead, but the victim survived and eventually escaped, leading to Bar Jonah's arrest. Unfortunately, due to his age and the leniency of the legal system at the time, he received a relatively light sentence. This early incident did little to curb Bar Jonah's desires. Instead, it seemed to embolden him. Over the next few years, he refined his techniques, learning how to manipulate and control his victims more effectively. By the time he legally changed his name to Nathaniel Bar Jonah, his fantasies had taken a much darker turn, involving not just sexual assault, but also torture and cannibalism. One of Bar Jonah's most notorious crimes before moving to Montana occurred in Webster, Massachusetts, in 1977. He abducted two young boys under the pretext of giving them a ride. Instead, he drove them to a remote location where he proceeded to violently assault and strangle them. Miraculously, both boys survived, but the psychological scars would last a lifetime. The case gained significant attention, and Bar Jonah was convicted of attempted murder. However, his sentence was again lenient, allowing him to be released on parole after serving only a few years. The leniency shown by the justice system in these early cases is a disturbing aspect of Bar Jonah's story. Had he been kept in prison, many of his later crimes might have been prevented. Instead, he was released back into society, free to continue his reign of terror. After moving to Great Falls, Montana in 1991, Bar Jonah began to indulge his darkest fantasies with even greater intensity. His modus operandi involved luring young boys into his apartment, often by posing as a police officer or offering them treats. Once inside, the boys would be subjected to unimaginable horrors. Bar Jonah's victims described being tied up, beaten, and sexually assaulted. In some cases, he would dress in women's clothing while committing these acts, further adding to the psychological torment. The cruelty of his actions was matched only by his cunning. Bar Jonah was skilled at manipulating his victims into silence, using threats and psychological control to ensure they would not report him. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Bar Jonah's crimes was his obsession with cannibalism. Evidence suggests that he did not just fantasize about eating his victims, he actually carried out these horrific acts. During the search of his apartment in 1999, investigators found a variety of disturbing items, including a meat grinder, cutting tools, and recipes that appeared to involve human flesh. One particular recipe, titled "Little Boy Pot Pie," was found in his journals. It included explicit instructions on how to prepare and cook a child. Bar Jonah's journals were filled with coded messages and references to cannibalism, leaving little doubt that he had acted on these twisted desires. Investigators believe that Bar Jonah's fascination with cannibalism stemmed from a need to exert ultimate control over his victims. By consuming their flesh, he felt he was not only dominating them physically, but also spiritually. This belief was reinforced by his delusional self-image as a divine figure. Further forensic analysis of the meat found in Bar Jonah's freezer confirmed that some of it contained human tissue, although the exact origins could not be definitively traced to any specific victim. Neighbors later recalled Bar Jonah inviting them to cookouts where he served deer or elk meat, which now seems almost certainly to have been human flesh. Bar Jonah's journals were a chilling testament to his depravity. Investigators found more than 1,000 pages of handwritten notes detailing his fantasies, his crimes, and his plans for future victims. The journals included lists of boys' names, some of whom were known victims, while others remain unidentified. These lists were accompanied by meticulous descriptions of how he planned to abduct, torture, and consume them. The journals also contained coded messages that, once deciphered, revealed even more disturbing details. Bar Jonah described his desire to eat children, viewing it as a way to gain power over them. In one entry, he wrote about his longing to prepare a stew made from the flesh of young boys, referring to them as tender meat. The detailed nature of these entries indicated that Bar Jonah had been planning his crimes for years, carefully selecting his victims and refining his methods. The journals also revealed that he had been fantasizing about cannibalism since his teenage years, suggesting that this was not a sudden impulse, but rather a deeply ingrained part of his psyche. One of the most haunting aspects of Bar Jonah's case is the number of potential victims who remain unidentified. While he was convicted of multiple crimes, investigators believe that the true number of his victims is far higher. The evidence found in his apartment, combined with the details in his journals, suggests that Bar Jonah may have been responsible for the deaths of several children whose disappearances remain unsolved. One of the most chilling cases involved a young boy who went missing in the early 1990s. Although Bar Jonah was never formally charged in connection with this case, investigators found a detailed description of the boy in his journals, along with a reference to feeding on his flesh. Despite extensive searches, the boy's body was never found, leaving his family in agonizing limbo. Another case involved a 13-year-old boy who disappeared while riding his bike in Great Falls. His remains were never recovered, but Bar Jonah had drawn a detailed map in his journal that appeared to show the location of the boy's burial site. Investigators conducted multiple searches of the area, but were unable to find any evidence. These unsolved cases highlight the frustrating limitations of the investigation. While Bar Jonah's journals provided valuable insights into his mind, they also left many questions unanswered. The lack of physical evidence in some cases made it difficult to secure convictions, even when the circumstantial evidence pointed strongly to Bar Jonah's involvement. Bar Jonah's arrest in 1999 was the result of a tip from a concerned citizen who had witnessed him engaging in suspicious behavior with a young boy. When police searched his apartment, they were unprepared for the horrors they would uncover. The evidence seized from Bar Jonah's home included not just the human remains and journals, but also a variety of tools and implements that suggested he had been torturing his victims. One of the most disturbing items found was a pair of handcuffs that had been modified to fit small wrists, indicating that Bar Jonah had specifically targeted young children. Investigators also found a collection of women's clothing, which he likely forced his victims to wear during their captivity. The psychological impact of these items on the victims was profound, adding another layer of torment to the physical abuse they endured. In addition to the physical evidence, police also discovered a hidden room in Bar Jonah's apartment that he had soundproofed and outfitted with restraints. This room, referred to by investigators as his torture chamber, was where many of his most horrific acts took place. The walls were covered with photographs of children, some of whom were later identified as victims, while others remain unknown. The revelation of Bar Jonah's crimes sent shockwaves through the Great Falls community. Many of his neighbors had known him for years, never suspecting that the friendly, if somewhat eccentric man in their midst was capable of such atrocities. The realization that they had unknowingly eaten human flesh at his barbecues left many in a state of profound shock and disbelief. For the families of Bar Jonah's victims, the discovery of his crimes was a nightmare come to life. Many had held out hope that their missing children would one day return home, only to learn that they had likely been murdered and consumed by a monster. The psychological toll on these families was immense, and many struggled to cope with the reality of what had happened. Bar Jonah's case also had a lasting impact on the broader criminal justice system. His ability to evade capture for so long, despite a history of violent behavior, highlighted significant flaws in the way predators were monitored and prosecuted. In the years following his conviction, there were numerous calls for reforms to prevent similar cases from slipping through the cracks.